being recorded.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Tiffany Ng. I'm a program manager here at NCB Capital Impact, working on the Homekeeper program, and I am pleased to introduce you all, if you haven't met her already, to Elizabeth Haney, who's also on the call. She is our new hire, our new staff person working with Homekeeper, and her primary role is to help all of you and all Homekeeper users be more successful in using it. And you will be hearing a lot more from her if you haven't already in the forums and in your email box and on these calls in the future. Liz, do you want to say hi? Are you there?
Yeah, hi everybody. I think I've spoken to some of you before. Some I've spoken to, some I haven't, but I'll be looking forward to working with all of you.
Yeah, probably the most exciting part for me is that she actually comes to us as a former Homekeeper user, so she brings a perspective that you folks will appreciate and something that we haven't had on staff before. So we're really excited to have her on staff. Also on the call with me is Laura Meerkat. She is the lead developer for Homekeeper from Bigger Boat Consulting. And she is also our lead trainer for Homekeeper. And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her to get us started with this training, Introduction to Salesforce Workflows. And I will say that before I turn it over that this was a topic that was highly requested when we did a survey recently of training topics. And so, you know, it will be available for you all as a recording as well as to everyone else who couldn't make it on the call in the future, and I hope that really you folks learn to embrace Salesforce workflows to help run Homekeeper and your programs better. I'll turn it over to Laura.
All right, good morning, and welcome everybody to Introduction to Salesforce Workflows. We actually have an agenda today, which is always exciting. We're just going to cover some of the basics of what are these things that we're talking about when we say Salesforce Workflows. What does that mean? We're going to get into some of the detail of what can cause a workflow to run and then what happens when that workflow does run. We're going to take a look at some of the workflow rules that we already have set up as part of the Homekeeper package. And then we're going to go through this kind of extended example of how a program might automate one of its big processes around occupancy certification. Then I'm going to turn it back to you guys to ask a little more about other examples or ways that you can think of that you might want to use workflow in Salesforce. And then we'll give you some resources for where you can find out more. And Tiffany, I'm getting quite a bit of background noise, so if there's any way we can work with that.
If you're from the area code 971, if you could mute your phone, that would be great. You can hear you typing. Thanks.
All right, thanks. So at its most basic, workflows are ways to tell Salesforce that you want something to automatically happen for you. So when something happens in Salesforce, then you want Salesforce to do something else for you automatically. And then what really you're defining when you define a workflow rule and the workflow actions that go with it are kind of what happens to fill in those blanks. So this is an example of what a basic workflow might look like. You start out with the evaluation criteria, which is when should we even be checking for these conditions. So in this case, we have an example of whenever a service file is created or anytime it's edited to meet our criteria. So that's the evaluation criteria. That's when would this thing even check to see if the conditions are met. Then you have the rule criteria, which is looking at the certain conditions. So if the status of is application submitted of that service file, then we want it to create a task for the program assistant to schedule a one-on-one meeting. So when we look back at our original two blanks, when blank happens, then Salesforce should automatically blank. Then this is kind of the first blank right here. Whenever a service file is created, check this condition, and if that condition is met, then complete this action. And when we actually go to set this up in Salesforce, the actual things that you're setting up are called workflow rules and workflow actions. So those first two pieces, which check for the workflow rule, and then the workflow action is what happens after that. You can have multiple actions that are associated with one rule. So in the condition that the status is application submitted, you might actually want to do a couple of different things. You might want to create a task for your staff person, schedule a one-on-one meeting, but you might also want to just automatically send out an email to that applicant to say, hey, thanks for applying, we're going to be in touch with you soon. And you can automate all of that process. So first we're going to look at the rule side of it, what can actually trigger an action. And we're going to use some different words. We might say that a workflow rule runs, we might say that it's triggered, we might say that it fires, but it all kind of means the same thing. So what causes that rule to even be checked in the first place? So your options for that are when a record is updated, at a designated time after a record is updated, or at a designated time before or after a date on the record, as long as that date is in the future. So I'm going to run through a couple examples of what I mean by that. But sorry. So those examples are when a service file status is set to application submitted. So that's an example of a rule that fires right away when a record is updated. Or it might be 14 days after a monitoring event status is set to active. So that is setting a certain time frame based off of when that rule was triggered. Or it could be if the appraisal received field is blank 7 days before the close date. So in that case, when we're looking at we have a time frame, 7 days, and we're comparing it to a date that's actually on the record itself. And so after that rule actually triggers, then it can cause certain actions to happen. It can send an email to users, so these are different Salesforce users on staff. Might be to let them know that you have a new applicant or that you have a foreclosure or something like that. You can send an email to contacts, so like the example that I just mentioned where you might want to say thank you for applying. You can, if you have that contact record saved as a part of the record that's being updated, like that application, then you can use that information to automatically fire off an email to that person. You can create a task. So this is where if you have a task that you want to assign to somebody on staff, like scheduling a meeting or making a phone call or sending a piece of mail, something that you can't actually automate that task, but you can automate the fact that the task itself is created, and you can set that task up to go ahead and email that person as well. So you can both notify them via email and track the ongoing status of that task kind of in one step. Or you can update a field. So we're going to go through an example where we have a certain date field that, unless otherwise specified, should always be 30 days after some other date. And that will be something that we can automate rather than having to remind users to kind of make that change manually every time. And I went through my examples as I was talking about these, but some of the examples, let's see if I didn't mention any of these. You can email a program user to let them know about a new foreclosure, email an applicant to thank them for applying, or assign a task to a program user to schedule a meeting. So I guess I'm very consistent in my examples, at least. So that was, before I start going into the workflows in HomeKeeper, that's the basic structure of what we're talking about. We're talking about workflow rules. We're telling Salesforce that when a record is updated in a certain way, then we want it to go out and do one or more tasks for us, or one or more actions for us. And those actions can be, sending an email, creating a task, that sort of thing. So there are some ways that we've already included workflows in HomeKeeper to automate certain things that are happening there for you guys. And if you actually went into your workflows in Salesforce and took a look at those workflows that are part of the HomeKeeper package, this is the list that you would see there. So we're doing a lot of these are field updates. For example, we have the option to calculate the total annual task if that field is left, or tax, if that field is left blank, or calculate the total assessed value when that field is left blank. And those are both examples of actually one way that workflows can be used, which is similar to the way that formula fields are used, but with the option to actually override whatever that formula would have said. So that's a request that we get quite a bit. We got a formula that is, for example, calculating the total annual tax, if that was truly a formula field, you would never be able to say, you know, actually I don't want to enter the monthly tax, I just want to enter the annual myself and not have it be calculated. You wouldn't have that option with a formula field, but with a workflow rule, you can kind of say conditionally, if I leave this blank and I have this other piece of information, then go ahead and update it for me. And if I actually put something in there myself, I don't want you to overwrite what I put in there. So anytime you want to see the workflow rules that are part of HomeKeeper, this information is totally visible to you from your Salesforce system. And we're going to hop in just a minute and start looking at where we actually control workflows in Salesforce. So you'll get really familiar with that area in just a moment. With that, I'm going to launch into kind of our extended example of how we might actually want to set this up for one specific program. So I'm going to tell you a little story about our fictional Orinda CLT that has an occupancy certification process that is based somewhat on a real system. So if this sounds familiar to anybody out there, it's partially true, it's partially made up. So at Orinda CLT, homeowners need to sign an occupancy certification affidavit annually to confirm that they still own their home and use it as their primary residence. And currently, the program assistant keeps a spreadsheet to track when everyone's occupancy certification is due. And this is kind of what the process looks like. If all goes as planned, then the program assistant will review her spreadsheet at the beginning of every month and figure out whose certification is due this month. She'll update their due date, then run a mail merge from that document, selecting the homeowners with the due date this month. The program assistant will send a letter that arrives 30 days before the due date that includes a copy of the form that needs to be signed. And when the homeowners return their form, she updates her spreadsheet. If the homeowner hasn't received the signed affidavit within 30 days, the program assistant runs a second batch of letters. She sends a second notice, which gives the homeowner another 15 days to respond. And if the form still isn't returned after that 15 days, the program assistant needs to notify the program director in writing. At one of the results of this process is that the program director has a quarterly report that they submit to state funding sources. So everyone has to check to see the spreadsheet to see whether a form has been completed or if the notices have been sent out. And if the program assistant forgets to mark a letter as sent, or if she calls in sick on the wrong day, then other staff members have to call each homeowner to follow up. And if anything ever happened to that spreadsheet, it would take a lot of digging through individual files to figure out everyone's status and fill out the quarterly report. So that's kind of the situation that we're starting with. And there's a lot of good things in this situation. For one thing, this program has actually a really clearly articulated process. We know what needs to happen, and we know exactly when it needs to happen. And that's really the first step to automating any sort of process, is having a process that's really ready to be automated in place. So there are also some bad things going on in this. And the main thing is that there's a spreadsheet that requires a lot of maintenance by one person, and depending on how well that spreadsheet is set up and how clearly everyone in the organization knows the process, then things could get missed, or if something ever happens to that file and it gets corrupted, then it would be kind of bad news. So there are some things we want to do to actually help automate this process and get all those processes happening within Salesforce. So here's some of the stuff that we're going to try to do today. We want to set the due date based on the date of the event, and this is just kind of a data entry ease of use issue. It's not that we couldn't set the due date ourselves, but let's say that if we don't already have one set, that it'll be 30 days out from the date. We're going to go ahead and set a grace period of 15 days if someone misses that initial due date. And once again, this is a field that if we wanted to, we could set a different number. But the automatic assumption, if we don't fill out a grace period, will be that that grace period should be 15 days. We want to email the first notice to the homeowner 30 days before the due date. And for the sake of automating this as much as possible, we have made a change in the process there. We said, for that first notice, it's actually okay if we just send out an email. If 5 days before the due date we still have not received anything back from that homeowner, we're going to assign a task to our program assistant to mail the second notice. And on the due date, if we still don't have our paperwork back, then we'll go ahead and email the homeowner a copy of the second notice as email, which they should already have in paper. At the end of the grace period, we're going to assign a task to the program assistant to call the homeowner and check in on them. And we're going to automatically send off an email to our program director about that record being delinquent. And this last one is not really, it's actually not a workflow issue, but just for the sake of automation, we're going to go ahead and schedule a monthly report that will kind of give the status of all delinquent occupancy certification records to our program director. So with that, I'm going to head into Salesforce and start working on setting up some of the rules that will accomplish those goals. So here we are back in Salesforce. And when we go into the setup, you'll actually notice there's one slight difference here. My setup is now no longer under my name because I've turned on a new version of the setup interface that's part of the Summer 13 release. But if you have not turned that on, you'll still find setup underneath your name dropdown. So from setup, I'm going to go into my workflow rules. So that's going to be under Create, Workflow, and Approvals, Workflow Rules. And the first time you actually come into the screen, you'll actually get a nice description that it will remind you of kind of some of the things that workflows can do. I'm going to turn this off so that we don't keep saying this all day, but this is actually, it's a pretty good short description, so you might want to leave that turned on. And now that we're in setup, the default view is going to be all workflow rules. So when I said that you could actually see all of the workflows that are part of HomeKeeper, this is where you can see those. There's also several workflows that are part of the Nonprofit Starter Pack, which you also have installed. So it might be a good idea to go ahead and come in here and kind of familiarize yourself with what's going on there as well. And although you can't actually make changes to workflows that are part of a managed package like HomeKeeper, you can deactivate a rule if you decide that it's actually not working for you. It's not, that your organizational process doesn't follow what that rule is doing. So the first thing that we had on our list was to set up a rule that says if there's no due date specified, but we do actually have a date for our monitoring event, then we want to automatically set our due date for 30 days in the future. So to do that, I'm going to create a new rule. And since we're talking about updating a field on monitoring events, and we're doing that by looking at a field on monitoring events, that's pretty easy to pick for the record that, the object that we're going to be updating. And then I need to give my rule a name. So we will, since the workflow process is kind of broken into rules on one side and actions on the other side, the rule name really could be more focused on what's triggering this action to happen. So we'll call this due date is blank. And I'm going to put 2 at the end of these just so I have a unique name because I was already working on this problem yesterday. So in the description, I'm going to actually say exactly what I expect my criteria to be so that if someone else is looking at this rule and they want to know what I was thinking, they actually get an idea. So we'll say runs when the date field on monitoring event is not blank, but the due date field is. So next we get to our evaluation criteria. You can either evaluate this rule, which means to check to see whether the conditions are present, when the record is created when it's created and every time that it's updated, and when it's created and any time it's edited to subsequently meet criteria. So generally, the default option is the third one, and that's usually going to be the one that you're going to want to use. If we said every time, or evaluate this record when it's created, but didn't check it any other time, that would mean if it initially did not meet those conditions, but then later did, your workflow rule would never run. It would only run at the time that the record was originally created in Salesforce. If we ran this rule every time the record was edited, we'd be running it a lot more than we need to. So if the condition was met the first time, and so our due date was blank the first time, well, actually, if the due date's blank, the way that we're checking this, it won't matter for this one. But basically, we could have already fulfilled our condition, and we'd continue running this rule repeatedly, even though we don't need to. And so the third one, which is whenever the record is created or anytime it's edited to meet our criteria, is really kind of the sweet spot that catches what we're looking for. So we want to set this up to run when the due date equals blank. And to do that, I'm just going to leave the value field blank. And when the date is not equal to blank, since I'm going to be using the date to calculate when that due date should be. I'm going to click Save and Next. And this is the screen where I can start defining my actions. So I can either add an action that will run immediately, or I can add an action that will run sometime in the future. For field updates, you're basically always going to want to run your action immediately. So what we're going to do is set the due date to 30 days after the date. I'm going to select due date from field to update. And the next box down here is actually really important for our particular example because we're going to be building additional workflow rules that are based on the due date. So this box says reevaluate workflow rules after the field change, which means after the due date has been set by this workflow rule. If we have additional rules that are based off of the due date, go ahead and run those as well. And then we can actually specify the value of the field. We're going to use a formula to set the new value. I'm going to click Show Formula Editor so that I get some help with building my formula. And then we said that we want it to be the date plus 30 days. So I'm going to go ahead and select date as the field, insert that into the formula, and type plus 30. Guess I did this a couple times yesterday. We'll call this one 3. So for now, I'm going to just be done with this rule, and so we can go actually take a look and see what that looks like. Before I actually go update a record, it's important to notice that workflow rules are created in an inactive state, so this actually is not currently going to run. So I do need to click Activate that before it's going to do anything. So let's open up a service file record. And go ahead and create a new monitoring event. Type occupancy certification. And the date is in June. And I'll set the status. And I'm actually going to go ahead and put a contact on here as well. And you'll notice that the due date is blank, but when I save the record, the due date has been automatically populated. And so has the grace period, which means that one of the rules I was setting up to test this is still active. Because that's the next one we were going to set up. Let's go back into our rules and take a look at that and make sure we get all the visible ones deactivated. I don't want to give away too much of the ending before we actually get there. So we'll deactivate this one. Deactivate that one. All right. And then the only one that's activated still here is the one that we just created. So let's go ahead and do our grace period, just for the sake of repetition. We'll call this one grace period is blank. We'll set it to 15 days by default. So I just pick grace period equals blank as my criteria. Click Save in this. And then add a new field update. And we will certification. all of the queued up actions based off of this rule would go away. But since we did say anytime it's edited to subsequently meet the criteria, if the status went from resolved back to active, that would re-queue those events. So here's where we're going to start to put in actually a bunch of different actions happening at different times based off of our monitoring event being an active occupancy certification record. So we'll start with our initial email. So the thing that we were trying to accomplish is 30 days before the due date, we want to send the homeowner an email for the first notice along with the affidavit form. So our time period is going to be 30 days before. And like I said, you could do this based off of the rule trigger date, but in this case, we're actually interested in one of the dates on the record, which is the due date. And now that we've set that time frame, now we can add our workflow action. So you do have the option to, as we've been doing, go ahead and create a new task, a new email alert, etc. You also can reuse actions that you've created in the past. So I'm going to do that one for this first email, and then I'll walk you through actually creating the second email next time. So to select an existing action, I can just pick the type of action that I'm looking for, and I can say, this is the one that I want to have happen. So this is an email alert that's sending the occupancy certification letter to the homeowner. I'll click save on that. So now we have this set up. So 30 days before the monitoring event's due date, this letter is going to get sent out. So the next thing we wanted to do was, if the homeowner still hasn't responded after 5 days before the due date, we're going to assign a task for the program assistant to send the second notice by mail. So our time frame on that one is 5 days before the due date. So 5 days before the due date. Let's go ahead and actually create the task this time. We're going to add a new task. We're going to assign it to our program assistant. And since this is a demo account, all of my users are conveniently named by the role that they do in this program. So this is send occupancy due date. And since I promised you I'd show you how to actually create that email alert, let's do it as a new email alert. certification to homeowner second. We're going to select an email template that we're going to use for this. And if you guys, we did a training probably a year ago about setting up email templates. It'd be great things to review. If you look at the training resources for today's training, I've also included a link back to kind of a refresher on how to set up these email templates. So I've already gone to the effort of setting up our second notice email. And then I'm going to actually pick for the recipient the related contact. So when it says related contact, it's looking at the field on the monitoring event, and that field is called contact. So if we're looking at this for a service file, you might see related contact applicant or related contact attorney or something like that. But in this case, it's just called contact. And that's why it was important that I actually included the contact on this monitoring event. So I'm going to move that person into our selected recipients. We could also set up additional people to email this to, or I could use the user option to select other people to receive this email. But right now I'm just going to leave it as a contact on the monitoring event. And I have this set to send from my emails. You can also send up set up organization-wide email addresses that would send from like program@orintheclt.org or info@orintheclt or something like that. So that's how you actually set up that workflow action. So you can see we're kind of building up a whole bunch of different things that will happen when this action is saved. So let's go ahead and activate this for a second just to take a look at the queue so you can get a sense of what actually happens when this thing runs. So I'm going to say done for now, and we'll come back to this later. I'm going to activate it. And then I'm going to go back and create, I'll just clone this one actually. I'm creating a new occupancy certification. And we'll let all of our rules run, so let's clear up those fields too. This homeownership. And so far it doesn't look like much is actually happening, but if I go back into setup, then I can actually go into an area called my time-based workflow queue and see all the things that are set up to happen. So this is under monitor time-based workflow. And like I said, I do have a new version of the setup interface, so this might be in a little bit different order than you're used to seeing these things. But if you search for time-based workflow, then you'll get this screen coming up. It's a little confusing because it doesn't show you any records by default. You do have to search, and if you want to see everything, you just leave the criteria blank. But now you'll see a bunch of things that are scheduled to happen in the future based off of that workflow that we've set up. So this first one is going to be the thing that sends out the actual notice, the first notice. The second one is going to be the task that tells the program assistant to follow up by mail. And then the third one is going to be the email that sends the second notice. And one thing that you'll notice in this queue is that the workflow rule name actually is based off of the thing that causes this to fire in the first place, not the action that happens. So even though it's actually really convenient to go ahead and set up one rule the way that I'm setting it up, where we have a bunch of things happening based off of this single workflow rule, it might make more sense for your organization if you did create separate workflow rules for each one of these actions, so that when you do take a look at the queue, you know which email is happening at which time or which task is happening at which time. So let's go through here and finish adding some different actions to this. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and clear everything out of this queue. So I Actually, there are two ways that you can clear things out of this queue, and maybe the other way makes more sense at this point. I can go in here and manually delete these actions. So if I say, you know, this never should have happened in the first place, go ahead and delete this. I have that option. But I also want you to notice what happens when I go back and change the monitored event record that we just set up. So I'm going into number 188 is the most recent. So this is a monitoring event that has all of those actions set up based on the fact that it is an occupancy certification record with an active status. If I go ahead and receive that letter from that homeowner and I want to say that this is resolved, and click Save, then that whole queue of actions, if I go search to refresh this, goes away. So even though we have set up all of these things to happen in the future, just in case our homeowner doesn't ever get back to us and return that certification letter, as soon as we say, actually this has been resolved, it's taken care of, all of those future events are cleared out. So to get back into our workflow rule and finish out all the other things that we said we wanted to do with it, let's see, the ones that we had left were, if the homeowner hasn't responded by the due date, no, we just did that one, send a copy of the second notice to the homeowner by email, and then the last one is, if the homeowner hasn't responded after the grace period is ended, assign the program assistant a task to call the homeowner and send an email to notify the program director. So, so we're going to add one more time-based action here. And to do that, I have to deactivate this rule. I can't add time-based actions to active rules. We'll click Edit. I'll add a time trigger. And this time trigger is going to be based off of a formula field called the final due date. And that formula field is just taking the due date and adding the grace period to it. So we set this formula field up just so I can use it for this trigger. And it's going to be, say we'll do this 0 days after the final due date. The two things we wanted to do were to assign a task and to send an email to notify the program director. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the existing actions that I've already set up. So this is a task to call the homeowner. And then set up the task to, the action to email the program director. And if I did have any questions about kind of what was going on in those things, if I wanted to take a look at what was actually in that message to the program director, I can always right-click on this description of this action, open it up in a new tab. See, this is kind of the action that we're talking about. This is the email template that it uses, so if I want to see what that looks like, I can click through there. And it looks something like this. It says the occupancy certification was due for a service file. And I'm actually going to show you the merged version of this, so you don't have to read too much of that. But this is basically just a really kind of quick and dirty notification internally. The emails that we have going out to our users are a little prettier and more sophisticated than this, but for our internal emails, they don't have to be anything too pretty. So we can close out of that and get back to finishing this up. And that's pretty much all we wanted to do with our time-based workflows here. So once again, I'm going to click Done to save that, and I do have to reactivate that. And so just to kind of show you guys what this looks like from the user's end, I did go ahead and create a version of this yesterday that instead of doing this 30 days or 60 days in the future, just went ahead and ran things one hour after another. So it starts off with, let's see, an email to our users. So you can see there's some merge fields in here. This is a nicely formatted HTML email that's running off of our template with our header on it. It's got some merge information that shows the date that their particular affidavit is due. And then it's got some merge information coming off of my user records, since I'm the one who sent it, and Homekeeper Trainer is just my name in this Salesforce system. And then we do have an attachment of the affidavit doc. Now, one of the limitations of this is that we cannot add any merge fields to that document. So in order to make this process work this way, I've included a document that's just all blanks that that homeowner would need to fill in. So that's what the homeowner sees. This is the second thing in this kind of workflow, which is the email that tells our program assistant that a new task has been assigned to her and gives her some information about that. And in fact, if I go over into that monitoring event, which was a different one for the service file, then we can see some of those activities show up in the open activities list. The third item in our list, aside from that big piece of actual physical mail that I obviously don't have in here because we can't fully automate that process, is our second email to our homeowner, which includes updated information about kind of their final due date and references their original due date. Then we've got the task for the program assistant to actually make a call to that homeowner. Finally, we've got the merged version of the email template I was just showing you that is just an internal message to the program director saying this person has not responded and giving them a link to the record so that they can actually look at it in Salesforce if they want more information. The last piece in here, just for our goals for automation that is not a workflow, was scheduling out that report that we referenced so that our program director is being updated every month with the overall delinquencies in this area. And to do that, this is hopefully a reminder that you guys are well familiar with, but we can schedule reports just by going into a report. And then under this run report area, there's a little bit of a drop down where I can schedule future runs. And this is where I select to me and or others, and I say I want to schedule this report to be emailed to our program director on the 20th day of every month, and then I set the start and end date for when I want that to happen. And so she's going to get an email that looks something like this without actually having to remember to log in again and look for that information. So that is the end of the big grand demo piece of this. So what we've done is taken kind of this process for making sure that someone has sent their occupancy certification in and then following up with that, and we've automated that so that there's a very standardized flow that this goes through. Let me hop back into my PowerPoint. So at this point, we wanted to kind of talk through some other ways that Homekeeper users might be interested in using workflows. So we've started this discussion on Zendesk. And this is actually the intro to Salesforce Workflows training post, but the first link under Zendesk resources is examples of Homekeeper workflows. So on the screen, you'll see some other ideas that we have had, but we were thinking that at this point, you guys might have some ideas of how you think that you might want to automate sending an email or automate updating a field value or automate creating a task for your users. So if you have any ideas about how you might use this in your program, maybe go ahead and enter those into the chat box now. And while you guys are doing that, I'll read off some of the ones we have here. Some of the ideas were to send an anniversary email to your applicant or co-applicant on the anniversary of their close date. Send an email to a primary applicant to let them know their application has been received I can use it for internal reminders. You can create tasks for coworkers to email transaction information to an attorney 1 week after the certified close date. You could create a task for staff to remind them to set up a legal doc review based on the close date. You could email a link for program evaluation 6 months after the close date. That's actually a really nice use case for that, simply because 6 months may be the time frame at which you would not necessarily remember to follow up with somebody if you didn't already have that kind of built into there. Or you can just use it kind of as we showed with the due date to make your data entry a little more convenient, a little more seamless. While we're waiting for any other examples to come in, I just want to point out one thing that I noticed while working on this, which is when you do have, I'm going to go into my one occupancy certification record that actually had all of its tasks fire. One thing that's kind of interesting about this is that those automated emails that go out don't automatically show up on this monitoring event record. And as I was reading about how other people have addressed this issue, a lot of them recommend at the same time that you're sending out that email to go ahead and create another task with a status of closed or completed that just notes that that email was sent and then copies kind of the body text of what that email was into here, so that when you do look at the activity history on this monitoring event, you can kind of see the full flow of which emails were sent out, as well as the tasks that were assigned to someone to follow up. All right, it looks like we don't have any takers on how you might want to use workflows, but I think it's a pretty interesting question for you guys to think about and share with each other. Thought I might have somebody on the phone there for a second. A couple other FAQs that I wanted to make sure that I pointed out, so this is here as much for a note to myself as anything. How does time-based workflow impact my existing records? So workflow rules are only going to work for times when the rule is fired after the rule is active. So if I had already had a bunch of active occupancy certification records in my system, and then I created a workflow rule that looks for those, that workflow rule would not fire. So it's something important to think about when you're dealing with kind of historical records. In order to make that workflow fire, I could kind of force it by changing the status from active to resolved and then changing it back to active, and that would cause that to fire. But otherwise, it's not going to do anything with existing records. I also mentioned that it would only work for dates that are in the future. So if, for example, I was trying to set up a record with a due date that was 5 days in the future, and I had my workflow that was looking to do something 30 days before the due date, that action that would be 30 days before would never actually run. It would show up in the queue past dated, but since we were already past that date, it would never actually send that email. So it's important to know that. We did go over how you can see which time-dependent actions are pending. That's under administration setup, under monitoring, and this is actually, I think, the older version that says monitor the workflow queue. I believe under the new version, it's actually just called time-based workflows. So that was right here, time-based workflow. And then what happens if I delete a record that has pending actions? It's going to be just like if you change that record so that it didn't meet the criteria anymore. It's going to go ahead and remove any pending actions from the workflow queue. And even if you undelete that record, those actions will not be restored. Oh, one other note, there is something else in the Salesforce universe called visual workflow. It's actually a cool topic for another day. It kind of lets you set up a step-by-step sort of wizard to walk your users through different tasks. But if you do see visual workflow when you're out looking at information about workflows, it's the same thing. So the naming is a little confusing, but I did want to call it out here that those are two different things. Both interesting, not the same thing. And then last but definitely not least, here's where you can go to learn more. There is official Salesforce documentation that's actually really useful in this case. And I've attached to our Homekeeper Zen post for this training just the subset of the PDF documentation that's just the Salesforce documentation about workflows. But you can also get there just by going to this link. There was a Dreamforce session last year called Getting Started with Workflows and Approvals that will probably cover a lot of the same topics that we covered today, but if you want a refresher, if you want to hear another perspective on that, that's a great place to get it. And then, as always, our Homekeeper Knowledge Base has a lot of great resources. And if you go to the Introduction to Salesforce Workflows page about today's training, and we do have a list of resources that are explicitly related to workflows. So this is some of the examples that we talked about. Here's a couple of basic how-tos of how to create a workflow to send email reminders or how to create a workflow to set a default work or field value. And then here's that link to how to create an email template if you wanted a refresher on that. So with that, I think that is the end of my presentation for today, and unlike normal, I think I've actually used up our full time, but I will stick around for questions if anybody has them. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Laura. That was really helpful. If anyone does want to stick around or chime in the chat box, I would love to hear what you thought about this session, whether it was helpful, whether it's something you can put to use right away, or whether you need more information. We are always trying to hone in on the level of complexity and value we can add, adding the Homekeeper perspective, and any information you can share or feedback would be great. And Laura, if you want to click on the 2013 training calendar, I don't know what dates we actually have, but you should be able to see that. On the right, you'll see something that says 2013 training calendar. We've added that link so that you can more quickly see what's coming up, and we will try and keep this up to date as we go and add new events. Looks like we need to update it still. So, great. Thank you so much, and we will be in touch. Have a great weekend, everybody.